National Day of Families, May 15th, 2018, Families and Inclusive Societies. Today, we have panel discussion organized by the Division for Inclusive Social Development of the Department of Economic and Social Affairs. First, we have Director Daniel Bass to give opening remarks, and then we have a keynote speaker in Dr. Bahara Trask, and three panelists. I think three panelists. Let's first welcome Director Bass.
Well, good afternoon for those who haven't seen me this morning. Happy special day devoted to family and all those people who are part of the family. That there is generations that are embraced in the family, but also welcome into another family. So today I'm your host. You are in the United Nations family, so welcome in this family as well. So let's celebrate whatever family we want to celebrate today. We have it in our hearts. I'm very happy about the topic that has been chosen to celebrate this very important day. That is the topic related to families and the inclusive societies. This morning I went to an expert group meeting we are having here in the headquarters. Some of the experts I see sitting around at this table, because we really want to make sure that the policies we are thinking of in order to strengthen the role of the family and make sure that families are included in how the society is evolving nowadays instead of excluded, be that it is families in urban areas or in rural areas. Well, this expert group meeting is going to bring to us some strong suggestions, innovative solutions, pragmatic solutions. I think that nowadays, when we talk about the family in a world that is changing so rapidly, we really have to think of the family in its new version. With the changes, demographic changes, we are living in the first industrial revolution that has also an impact on the family and the components and members of the family. We know that the focus will be on the Sustainable Development Goal 16, that is about inclusive societies. But we will also focus on resilience, and I think that in promoting this day and celebrating this day, we also want to make sure that we empower families in whatever ways we think families should be empowered, to make sure that they keep playing a vital role in creating and sustaining peaceful and inclusive societies. This is a key role of families, which is indispensable for sustainable and inclusive development. Another area why we're celebrating families and family policies for inclusive societies definitely is when it comes to children and youth. Youth of today are already the citizens who will be thinking about policies for families, and maybe they think about family in a different concept. We're living in a globalized world, while in the past usually members of the family were belonging to the same group, meaning the same nations, Italians with Italians, Chinese with Chinese, Kenyatis from Kenya. Nowadays, living in this globalized world, actually we have families, and we do not know how these new families are going to look like, where, for instance, a parent is from one country, another from another country, but children were born, maybe one child in one country, the second child in another country as well. And so they get all these different influences. And so when we think about inclusive societies, we have also to think about this phenomenon that is happening. So families nowadays are changing. So children, wherever they grow up, in whatever kind of family they grow up, needed to live in a stable and supportive family, and need to develop positive cognitive, emotional, and social characters, thus becoming secure and peaceful adults. Peace is so important, and families, whatever their shape is, have to be empowered and have to have the right tools and instruments to be able, therefore, to grow also the citizens of the future, the citizens of tomorrow, children and youth. And moreover, access to justice for all family members includes the achievement of Target 16.9 under the Sustainable Development Goal 16, that is the one about inclusive societies. Provide legal identity for all, including birth registration for children. I do know that for some groups, indigenous groups, this has been an issue because for political reasons, some indigenous communities preferred not to register and be identified. We have to keep in mind also these phenomena. And I recall once when I was visiting Algeria, and then I decided to have a tour in the desert, and I had the opportunity to meet some Bedouins. We go back many years ago. Many years ago. I was 28. So really many years ago. And I recall, oh my gosh, and I recall talking to a group of these Bedouins because they wanted to buy me for a number of camels. I don't remember, but it was an interesting experience. And they told me that actually with all these borders, they were feeling trapped because they crossed the desert, and the desert with their families has no frontiers. So what happens when a child is born in one part of the desert that doesn't belong to a certain country, etc., etc.? So all these aspects should be considered when we talk about inclusive societies. I think I will stop here. Thank you for the talking points prepared my colleagues that I haven't used much, but I preferred to add something that belongs also to my personal experience. So let's celebrate families. Let's celebrate this amazing day, the International Day of the Family, in all its different aspects. Thank you so much.
You set a great stage for the exciting and panel speakers. And first, I would like to introduce Dr. Bahira Trask. She's a professor and chair of Human Development and Family Studies at the University of Delaware. Yeah. Welcome, Dr. Trask.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for this lovely introduction, Jan, and thank you for inviting me, Ms. Daniela Bas and Ms. Renata Kazmerska, and I'd also like to thank Alberto Padova for this wonderful opportunity, and I'd like to welcome all of you to this special occasion. Before I begin my talk, I would like you to close your eyes for a minute, and I would like you to reimagine the world, a world where there is no war, where there is no political conflict, where we're not worried about climate change, where everybody has enough to eat, people have shelter, and they have access to education for their children, and they have access to health services. This is what transforming our world, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, is all about. It was adopted in September 2015, and what makes it unique is that every country in the world has to meet the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. It's a holistic focus that primarily focuses on ending poverty, promoting economic prosperity, protecting the environment, and our focus today is on social development and promoting people's well-being. The Sustainable Development Goals fundamentally build on the philosophical foundation of the United Nations that everybody, that every individual has a right to life's basic necessities, no matter where in the world they live or what it is they do, and that these include social rights as well. I have been asked for today to speak about SDG 16, promoting peaceful and inclusive societies, and within that I've been asked to talk about the rule of law and providing legal identity and what that means with respect to families. I want you to remember throughout my talk that social rights are basic to having peaceful, inclusive societies, and I will build on this. However, from my perspective, as somebody who has devoted my professional career to the study of families, a huge omission throughout the agenda is a concrete focus on supporting and strengthening families. There are 169 targets within these 17 SDGs. Only 3 of them mention families. However, from my perspective, and I know from my colleagues who study the same issues, without a family-focused approach that takes into account the context in which individuals make decisions about programs, policies, and laws, we will not achieve these 17 goals. And that is what I'm going to argue today, that the focus really needs to be on strengthening, supporting, and identifying families. So you may be sitting here and thinking, especially if you're from the western part of the world, families really don't matter anymore. That is a complete fallacy. Families matter all over the world. And I've listed just the most basic reasons for which they still matter, basically for everybody. Families give people initially a sense of personal and social identity. Families are a basic unit of support. They provide shelter, food, and clothing for their dependents. You can't be a baby or a child and just be on your own. Families continue to be the most efficient unit for rearing and nurturing children. We've had experiments in the past. I am also older now, and I remember when people thought everybody was going to live in communes. For those of you who are younger, that was actually an objective. As you can tell, that didn't work out, yeah? So most people pretty much are raising their children in families and not in communes. And families still provide care for vulnerable individuals, people who are disabled, people who are terminally ill, frail, elderly. So in whatever their configuration, families still matter to individuals, and people make their decisions in family contexts. The most basic or fundamental foundation for families is around economics. There is a great deal of research that shows us that when families are faced with extreme poverty, when they can't access health insurance, when they have poor childcare, when educational systems fail, or, as we will be talking about, when they are exposed to extreme political violence, they are unable to perform their functions. These stressors then have long-term effects, not just on early childhood, but also on youth and follow youth into adult life. It's not just poverty that is a problem, but also inequality. There is a very interesting global study by Wilkinson and Pickett that shows that there's a strong correlation between bad health, social problems, and inequality. And what's really interesting they found in their study is that inequality within societies matters more than inequality between societies. So if you know that you can't access all these great services that exist in the society, what happens is you start to not trust your government and the market and all of that. So there's a disintegration of the society that starts to happen when there is great inequality. My research focuses on globalization, and globalization broadly defined, globalization as the integration of markets, but also of ideas and people, everybody moving much faster. And one of the things that has happened globally is that markets have become the primary force. We now look at the economic system as ruling everything, and the effect of that has been that government or state support for families are shrinking. The result of that is that family relationships remain and actually for many people have become more important, not less important. So they rely on their families more for economics. We are part of this expert group meeting, and tomorrow we're going to be talking about housing. And one of the things I've discovered in my reading is that increasingly as housing prices have gone up and as home ownership becomes the model globally, the young people don't have the money to buy houses, and so they're increasingly relying on family members to get money to buy their houses, and that's actually contributing to family solidarity. Another issue facing families is the growing refugee crisis. There are currently 65.6 million people who are displaced in some form. This is the largest number of people who've been displaced since World War II. They come from different parts of the world, and we often don't acknowledge that. There's this image in our heads that everybody's coming from Syria. Actually, they're coming from different parts of the world and for different reasons, including for climate change. And not to be too depressing, but the other day I was driving to work and I was listening to NPR, and there was a man wrote a new book, and he was discussing his book, and he said, we're at the beginning of seeing the displacement of people through climate change, that over the next 20 years, those numbers were going to grow exponentially. So we're at the beginning of this problem, not in the midst or at the end of the problem. When people are displaced and are the victims of political conflict, this is often accompanied by human rights violations. It disrupts families, and it disrupts the compact between individuals, families, and governments. Especially children are vulnerable in these sort of situations. And a big problem that's going to keep coming up in my talk is we don't have data on a lot of these issues. We know a little bit, and much of it is anecdotal, but we don't have good statistics to back up some of the things that we're saying. So UNICEF estimates that currently 28 million children around the world have been displaced. 1 million of them are asylum-seeking children, and alone in Europe last year there were 170,000 lone child refugees. Children make up 51% of the world's refugees, despite being less than 1/3 of the global population. And so you can see the majority of refugees are actually children. So when children grow up under these circumstances, their life chances are worsened, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. The other challenge facing our world, and especially SDG 16, is the growing youth population. Again, I think this is something we don't put enough emphasis on. The global population is about 7.4 billion people. Out of those, 1.8 billion people are young people. And the United Nations reports that there are currently more young people alive than ever before in human history. We talk a lot about aging, and aging, of course, is a big challenge for our society, but this growing youth population is another very difficult challenge for our society. And this picture just gives you a little bit of an idea about where they are located, and you can see the growth of the youth population is primarily in middle and low-income countries, with the United States an exception. This growing youth population could be an asset, and it could be a challenge. It depends how we deal with it. All these young people need an education, they need training opportunities, and most importantly, they need to be incorporated into the paid labor force. Every year, about 120 million people, young people, reach working age. They need meaningful employment, and they need to be integrated into civic life. There are many countries where more than 1/3 of the young people have no employment opportunities at all. For example, in Greece currently, 43% of young people are unemployed. In Spain, it's about 1/3, Portugal, about 1/3. When there are no jobs, what happens is that young people don't know how to plan out their lives. Their life course trajectory is not clear. They can't go to school. They don't know, should I go to school, should I not? What will I do once I have this education? If I don't have a job, I cannot marry and I cannot take care of a family. So the life course trajectory that most of us grew up with, that we took for granted, it's not there for a lot of these young people. So vulnerable economic conditions lead to instability on the family level, and that then leads to social unrest. And we're starting to see some of that from other parts of the world. Also, I spoke before about inequality. Well, social media is also fueling images of inequality, because if I'm unable to get a job and unable to start a family, and I see that in a neighboring community or in another country, other people my age are living a completely different type of life with every type of opportunity, it makes people resentful. I was reading a really interesting article on poverty, that the concept of poverty is changing because people are much more aware of what could be and what they don't have access to. And so it's not just the absolute numbers that matter, it is also the images that come with these numbers. Gender issues, which I'm going to get more into, are rampant, especially for poorer girls and women. And we'll talk more about that because the whole gender issue is extremely complicated because every country is trying to address gender issues, including here in the United States, but we're not particularly successful. So, children who grow up in extreme poverty, who don't have legal identities, something I'm going to talk about in a minute, or who are refugees, are less likely to become productive, committed, healthy citizens. However, there's a solution, because when families are supported through appropriate policies and programs, societies end up with people who care, people who want to do good, people who are more peaceful. So, families are fundamentally the primary unit that promotes peace in society, both on a micro level and in a more macro level way. For example, there's a large body of research that comes out of the early childhood field that shows that when children attach securely to a caregiver, they grow up to become more peaceful individuals. They're less hostile, they have more stable adult personalities. So families can create within their unit their own sociology of peace. When families are peaceful, this spills out into the larger society, and we get more national and international peaceful contexts. So, how do we achieve peace on a more formal level? Well, the most basic, fundamental way is through the rule of law. The rule of law is foundational. It is the social contract between individuals, families, and states that they will be taken care of. However, when we start talking about families, there's a fundamental tension that's there because you have legal frameworks and you have personal relationships. And the question is, where are governments and states allowed to intervene in what are seen as personal relationships? And in every society, this is dealt with in a somewhat different way. Marriage is an example of that. Who's allowed to marry and at what age? I come from Delaware, and Delaware just passed the first law, I think it was this week in the country, that children under the age of 18 are not allowed to get married. So that is an example of that sort of tension. But there are places where children can marry at any age. In the United States, those are laws that are on the books. So the legal framework provides protection, especially for the most vulnerable people in society, persons with disabilities, the poor, children. What is really interesting is that under global legal frameworks, children have a right to family life. And for example, the European Court of Justice has determined that children have a right to family life if they are born in marriage, if they are born out of marriage, if the parents divorce, and they still retain their inheritance rights. Also, the rights of women are specifically protected under the legal frameworks of every country around the world. If that really happens is a different issue, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. But the formal framework is there. I'm an anthropologist, and in anthropology there's the concept of the ideal versus the real. What we say is happening versus what is actually happening. The problem with legal frameworks is that they don't function for everybody. So many people don't have access to legal procedures. For example, in Africa, 39 countries adopted a social policy framework for benefits, but it only included people who were in the paid labor force. And by the way, that's true in a lot of countries. If you're in the paid labor force, you get all kinds of benefits. But if you're not in the paid labor force for whatever reason, then you don't get the benefits that are on the books. Oh, I better hurry up. I have a lot more. Okay, thank you. We also have contradictory bodies of law. So we have different levels of law going on. We have customary law, and we have, the legal frameworks that are set by the state. A lot of people cannot access laws. There's a concept called legal literacy. People don't understand what the laws are about. That's true in Western and non-Western societies. For example, I teach a course about marriage and divorce and family life. Most people don't know what the divorce law is until they actually go through the divorce. So, we have those issues. For rural women, poor women, they often have limited opportunities to interact with administrative bodies. So the laws may be on the books, they can't access the laws. I'm going to skip some of my examples. Landholding is a particular problem around the world. So there are many agricultural workers who are women, but actually being able to own the land is very difficult. For example, in Bangladesh, only 3% of women are landowners. Then we have issues around child marriage and human trafficking of women, despite there being international and national laws in place against these sort of things. Legal identity is another huge issue. 1.1 billion people do not have legal identity, and legal identity is not just having a birth certificate. And the big problem with legal identity is that we currently don't have an internationally recognized definition what it is. If you do not have legal identity in the society in which you live, you can't access its services. You can't get health care, you can't enroll your children in schools, all of this sort of thing. So legal identity is a key to access social protections, and it also keeps governments accountable to providing the services that individual needs. Women, again, are particularly vulnerable in these situations for a whole host of cultural reasons and oftentimes opposition from family members. Very quickly, I have some recommendations. I'll just give you a couple of them since I am clearly out of time. One of the most basic ones is we need data. I said this before, there is not enough data, and we need to increase awareness among policymakers about the linkages between family functions and contributions and creating peaceful and inclusive societies. We need to engage and focus on youth, provide opportunities for youth. We need to restructure our educational systems so that all youth have opportunities to training. For example, social media using communication technologies. There are experiments around the world with providing education, long-distance education. We need to be focusing more in those directions. We need to disseminate information about early childhood development, positive youth development, gender equality. There are currently some very interesting programs in China, in Singapore, in Taiwan, and in Canada that focus specifically on how you create family sustainability, which is how do you improve relationships between family members and create a sense of unity so that people work together. We need to use social and digital media to combat gender stereotypes. Again, there are some very interesting examples coming from sub-Saharan Africa, for example, out of Botswana and Malawi. We need to create family ministries and family hubs. In England, they've started creating these family hubs. It's one place that you go to, and you can get legal advice, you can learn about birth registration, training opportunities, medical advice, but it's just one place, so it's easy for the people to understand where they go to get the information that they need. My last recommendation is for academics, which is we need to be engaging in much more global family-focused research. It needs to be quantitative and qualitative. We need interdisciplinary research teams, and we need to assist governments and states in creating rights-based curricula, which include gender focus for both women and men. It shouldn't just be targeted towards girls and women. It needs to be targeted against men also. I want to end with saying that families can only be successful and thrive in contexts where there's the rule of law, where people attain legal identities, contexts that have economic and social opportunities, where there's a lack of political conflict, because families need to be able to raise healthy, peaceful children, have supportive relationships, and support gender equality and opportunities. And I'd like to end by saying it is only through a systemic, family-focused approach that we can reach the most vulnerable individuals and families worldwide and assist them in realizing their capabilities, their rights, and full potential. And that will lead us to accomplishing SDG 16, having a more inclusive, peaceful world.
How important social inclusive for families and how policy matters as well. Our next speaker is Professor Monty Makiwini, professor in Human Science Research Council, South Africa. His topic is families in inclusive society in Africa. I will ask the audience to hold our questions until all presenters have spoken, and then we open for questions.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to speak very briefly about families in Africa. Family remains a fundamental social institution in Africa where the building of a society begins. Thus, African charters recognize the family institution as the foundation of society. So, African charters recognize it as the foundation institution, as the foundation of society, not just one of the foundations of society, which means that all other concepts are built on family. Family is more than just one among institutions, as sometimes just as in other parts of the world. African charters recognize the traditional family, African family, and family in Africa refers to what in other parts of the world is called extended family. It includes aunts, uncles, cousins, grandparents, and other relatives. These relatives form a unit that function in unison. While African charters recognize the African family, they also recognize that they acknowledge and affirm diversity in family structures, that family structures are diversifying for a number of reasons in Africa, just as is the case anywhere in the world. So recognizing traditional African family is not to say that it is the only structure that is there in Africa. Family and households do not connote the same thing. Many people, many families, in fact, they stay in more than one household, and that's very important, that when you speak about families, you are not necessarily speaking about a household. Lineages are not necessarily biological, but they are also sociological. Lineage and kinship is sometimes edited, and this is done without going through legal instruments, which are complicated, and families in Africa, it's easy to adopt someone who doesn't historically belong to a certain family. Lineages cut across a number of generations, both the living and the dead. It connects relatives far and near. And as migration is increasing, it means that a family is distributed far and wide, and even sometimes across continents. I'm making a quote from Nelson Mandela. My mother presided over 3 huts at Kunu, which, as I remember, were always filled with babies and children of my relations. In fact, I hardly recall any occasion as a child when I was alone. In African culture, the sons and daughters of one's aunts and uncles are considered brothers and sisters, not cousins. This is the type of a family that you typically get in Africa. The family is playing a big role in Africa. We remember the occasion in Ghanaian migrants when they were deported from Nigeria in the 1980s. And while Western aid agencies were planning an intervention, the deported migrants were reintegrated into families and communities within 2 weeks, which means that those migrants, in spite of the fact that they were spatially distributed and far away, they still had connection with their families. So the families played something that would have cost aid agencies a lot of money. And also, we know about AIDS orphans in Africa, that millions and millions of AIDS orphans are cared by families. And we also know about the role of remittances in Africa. Without remittances from members of families who have moved away for better life, many of the families left behind would have been decimated. Now, family is being challenged by mobility. As we know, there's a lot of social strife in Africa because of spatial inequalities. And because of spatial inequalities, there's resultant constant movement on the continent. And these spatial inequalities have never been bridged in spite of all the efforts. And these movements are often gender biased. And many people struggle the places of work and the places of origin. So they live in the two worlds all the time. They're still connected to their family, but they are still connected to the places of work. Now, there's a problem with this. One of the problems is the fact that the borders in Africa were drawn during colonial times, and they typically divide families and linguistic groups, making a movement very difficult because political borders are becoming more restrictive in the way they allow people. So if a person is working in another country, it's very difficult for his family to join him and so on. And sometimes the concept of human trafficking is used as an excuse to prevent children to join their parents. There is also a problem of high cost of living in the city, which they must cope with while at the same time supporting the family in the places of origin. Many have an obligation to send remittances to the places of origin, while acknowledging the role played by mobile phones. Mobile phones have become very common in Africa, but the cost of communication remains extremely high. Mobile data in Africa is very expensive. It's not like in the West. There is also a problem of poor or non-existent road and rail infrastructure, making movements between places of work and places of origin very difficult. And many of them, they die while trying to connect to their places of origin. As I've said, family remains a basic and natural unit in Africa, and the concept of Ubuntu, which is what is binding families, which means I am because we are. So many members who have left families, they are still connected. They still see themselves as part of their own families. Now, I will make some suggestions in order to assist. I am suggesting that the family institution must continue to be seen as a foundation of society just because there is no other alternative. And we acknowledge, of course, while recognizing the traditional African family, we acknowledge and affirm complexities and diversification of families. We acknowledge the extended family, not just acknowledging it in family charters, but we must have policies that are able to implement so that the extended family can survive and thrive. And we should also promote positive family values like the concept of Ubuntu. I'm also suggesting that there should be more affordable mobile data all over the world to make sure that families are able to connect easily, and a better transport system. I'm also suggesting that something must be done to make movements of family members across political borders much easier. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Mashmanti Makiwini. And our next presenter is Shanti Samaya, Deputy Dean, Faculty of the Arts and Social Sciences, University of Malaya. Her presentation topic is family policies for social inclusion in Asia with a gender perspective.
Okay, I'm going straight into my presentation. Yes, I'm focusing on Asia, and predominantly the data I could get my hands on were from Southeast Asia and from East Asia. So predominantly the presentation will be focused on these parts of Asia. So there is a remarkable diversity between countries in Asia in terms of the types of family policies implemented in these countries. So I'm looking at family policies already implemented in these countries. Family policies contain both an assurance to upholding the traditional family and an acceptance that the diversity of contemporary family forms, which demands a more pragmatic approach. So governments have actually taken a pragmatic approach. Although they talk about the Asian value and Asian family, they realize that a diversity of family forms are emerging in Asia. So most Asian governments recognize the importance of the family. However, family issues are gradually declining in importance on the national and international development stage, which requires country-level obligations to ensure inclusive and equitable support to families with a focus on gender equality and empowerment in order to achieve the SDG goals. The family can both protect and be detrimental to women and girls' lives and well-being. So I'm bringing a gender focus to this presentation of mine. It is therefore of utmost importance that a gender perspective is brought into family policies at the formulation stage that integrates the SDG goals. Some countries already have family policies in place, but in Malaysia we have the family policy. But to what extent SDG goals have been integrated in the formulation of the SDG, of the family policy, when the family policy was formulated, the SDG was not there yet. So we have to revisit. Okay. Social inclusion. The term has been used throughout, from morning till now. So I'm referring to Nancy Fraser, has argued forcefully that justice today requires redistribution and recognition. She has proposed an analysis with two irreducible dimensions of justice, redistribution and recognition. The point is that there is a real dilemma between an ideal about social equality based on socioeconomic redistribution and an ideal of equity based on cultural recognition. Both conditions must be satisfied if participatory parity is to be achieved. Fraser's three key concepts of redistribution, recognition, and participation can be useful in our understanding of social inclusion. Gender perspective. I'm dealing with all the three concepts I've been asked to look into by the organizers of today's conference. So the lack of gender equality with respect to economic, social, educational, and employment opportunities continues despite the commitment and efforts of governments in Asia to this issue. All Asian countries predominantly have, most Asian countries have ratified the CEDAW. So there is a commitment, but to what extent that commitment translates into action is another thing. The unequal relationship between men and women remains rooted in cultural norms and social relationships. Feminist scholars have criticized mainstream analysis of inequality and welfare state for their neglect of gender. They argue that gender is one of the most important factors that must be considered in analysis of inequality in the welfare states. Analysis of the role of gender in distributive processes brings a worthwhile unit of analysis to the fore, which is the family and the household, which are typically taken as basic observational units where we can actually see in concrete terms how equality is practiced, how distribution, the distributive processes are taking place within that institution. We can see, observe, compared to larger institutions. Okay, some areas needing a gender perspective on family policies in Asia. So I will just focus on three main areas for today's presentation. First is declining fertility. Fertility decline in Europe and in the Western world took some time. In Asia, it's very rapid, the speed that we were talking about this morning. It is happening very fast. And that is very worrying because it's got other implications. So this is some data for some East Asian countries, South Asia, Sri Lanka is included, and Southeast Asia, Philippines and Malaysia, whatever data I could get my hands on. So it's declining to below replacement level. If you see from 1990 to 2000, I mean, the decline for most countries has gone below replacement level except for the Southeast Asian countries. Fertility decline began in Japan much earlier than the other countries and reached replacement level by the 1970s. And the fertility rates in Singapore, Korea, and Taiwan declined rapidly in the 1960s, and the most rapid decline in China was in the 1970s and 80s. The mean age of first birth has increased dramatically in most countries due to better access to education for females and the increase in mean age at first marriage. Given the link between marriage and fertility, the impact of delayed marriages can be linked to declines in fertility. It's also a matter of choice, but delayed marriage has implications on fertility. The Asian flight from marriage for women is being observed in several Asian countries. And in addition, crude divorce rates also grew steadily and significantly. A larger percentage of divorces are those that involve children. Okay? Trying to protect the family, trying to safeguard the family, but there's a lot of threat and risk to that institution. There is, in general, a preference for two-child family, and this unmet. I mean, in most Asian countries, there is that preference for a two-child family, but this unmet need for children could provide a space in which policies could be implemented to support childbearing. This unmet need was observed for Japan, for Korea, and for Singapore. So couples and single people actually desire to have more children, but they don't end up having more children. So we consider that unmet need. So the fertility decline observed should be explained as not just the choice of couples, but the existence of barriers to fulfilling that need. So for these advanced Asian countries, as stated by McDonald, that they are in a low fertility trap. So policy initiatives are mostly in the form of cash benefits. For Japan, there's a universal support for they give child allowances. And for Korea and Singapore has a baby bonus. And for China, Hong Kong, and Malaysia, there are supports for underprivileged children. Children from poor households get allowances. Although these policies aim at social inclusion of children through cash benefits, but its redistributive role have minimal impact on gender equality, and its outcome for fulfilling the unmet need for children will not be achieved due to its lack of a gender perspective in the policy domain. So it's important if you want to have, the families to fulfill this need to have more children, there is a need to bring in the gender perspective. Female employment is another area, and the family. Let's look at female employment in Asia. In most East Asian countries, it's on the rise since the 1990s. The countries that show a relatively high female employment rate since 2010 include some developing countries such as Vietnam, China, and Thailand. So in Southeast Asia, Brunei, Singapore, all enjoying very high employment rates for females. These are some data I have. And female employment in the upper middle income countries also it's increasing, but we tend to see a decline in female employment during the at the age when they have children. So the 25 to 35 years, you see labor force participation rates declining. It reaches a peak and then it goes down. This is data for Malaysia. So due to difficulties of balancing work and family, many mothers with children drop out of the labor market, and this hinders their career building. The exit from the workforce for women is quite obvious that women are exiting for marriage, childbearing, and child-rearing. And policy initiatives in Asia, with an increasing female labor force participation rate in East and Southeast Asia, the lack of a work-family balance policy is directly related to women dropping out of the labor force because women are predominantly doing the child-rearing and child care. And bringing a gender perspective into the family policy domain by addressing the social exclusion of mothers and women taking care of children from the labor market is paramount in ensuring justice to women by removing obstacles to income earning potential and facilitating the process of women being financially independent and therefore less at risk of being subjected to domestic violence and other forms of vulnerabilities. Aging is another problem. We never talk about aging in Asia, but aging is also happening in Asia. And like childcare, elder care is also predominantly done by women, and we also see women dropping out of the labor force to take care of the elder. There is a decline at the later age. When they should be at the peak of their career, they're dropping out to take care of the elders. So in Asia, there seems to be a very female, women are doing most of the care work, even if they are working. And in conclusion, family policies for social inclusion. Developing countries in Asia have experienced changes in family structure and relations of family togetherness with decreases in family fertility. Asia needs to work on family policies dealing with these changes in the family. It is a big challenge for most Asian countries because they are struggling even with formulating social welfare policy for the disadvantaged people. The trends that is changing the family, such as the aging population, declining fertility rates, and decline in the commitment to marriage, and in family solidarity, such as higher divorce rates and declining of co-residence with the elder generations, are becoming very prevalent in Asia. And in Asia, both children and the elderly have relied on their families, especially women, to meet their care needs. So the family has played an extremely important role in caring for both the children and the elderly. This division of labor is not sustainable and is an obstacle to social inclusion of women, which hinders the redistributive role of paid employment for women. So the traditional family model, which is with its traditional gender roles, which is expecting women to bear the dual responsibility of caregiving and wage earning, is no longer just. There is a need for a pro-egalitarian model for family policy to promote gender equality. And with that, also safeguard and sustain the family. Government need to take responsibility to help women to combine paid work and family responsibility and to get fathers to play a larger role in household chores, elder care, and child care, if we are interested in maintaining and safeguarding the institution of the family. Thank you. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Again, thank you, Renata, for the invitation. It's a pleasure for me to be here and to present briefly for 10 minutes my paper. If you're interested in it, it is available. On the family website, of the UN family website. So I got to begin by defining who is an indigenous person. And people of indigenous background are persons who descend from the population that inhabited the region of the Western Hemisphere, because I'm referring to Latin America, at the moment of the conquest, the encounter, or the establishment of the present state boundaries. So it is difficult to identify the size, although I'm going to be presenting some figures of the indigenous population, because people have to self-identify as such. And there are certain dimensions that individuals need to consider in making that decision, self-identifying as indigenous, and that has to do with territory, has to do with common origin, with linguistic and cultural correspondence to one of the more than 1,000 indigenous communities that exist in Latin America. So, in order to put together my paper, I looked at a lot of information and contributions made by the United States, by other multilaterals, by organizations, think tanks that work to advance the rights of indigenous people, and also the work of anthropologists, sociologists, and other experts. I'm by training an economist, and I truly went out of my discipline in order to gather and put that information and conceptualize about it. But I'm an economist who does a lot of interdisciplinary work. I'm going to begin with my main findings, and then I'm going to go one by one, discussing some of them. So the first thing is that although the road to acknowledging the rights of indigenous people has been bumpy, at the end it exists, and many nations in Latin America do acknowledge not only their identity but also their rights to land. But normative acknowledgement aside, in real life there is major exclusion of indigenous families, and their lands have been usurpated for commercial use, extraction as well as commercial agriculture. To just briefly, conceptually, what explains that? And what explains this is this attempt of nation states in the region to define themselves as homogeneous unities, to normalize their culture. And by so doing, they have discounted the indigenous heritage. So that's been probably not intentional, but the result has been that this way of defining themselves as without attention to ethnicity, to gender, that has generated an actual exclusion of indigenous people. And so we can say that those definitions are to some extent simplistic, and that we need to, in the definition of citizenship, we need to recognize the diversity of indigenous and non-more Western types of identities that exist. Another interesting challenge that exists in the region today is that there's been a lot of protests and social movements that have been initiated by indigenous women and then followed by the community. And they have attained certain things, but overall, it's a paradox because they have become indigenous women at the mercy of what my colleague Shanti was just telling, that women taken on their shoulders a lot of care work. So as states have been retrenching from social services, increasingly women have been taking on that role of giving care. Other findings include the fact that levels of poverty are enormous and unproportional to the presence of indigenous people. Families are fragmented, and in that sense, I also would agree with the perspectives that Monde, my colleague, was presenting on Africa, and how families are fragmented in terms of their geographical use of space. Some members remain in rural areas and others have moved to urban areas. And then the other thing is that girls and women are very vulnerable to patriarchal societies, and there is evidence that in some indigenous communities, women are leads in the household, and they direct males to do certain things and run errands. However, and this is because of an understanding of roles in terms of reciprocity more than in terms of equity. But overall, we see that there is a lot of discrimination, sexual abuse, beating, human trafficking, and exploitation in the job force of girls and women. Despite the fact that their presence is, in terms of percentages, higher in rural areas, when we look at the numbers, there are more people of indigenous background that currently reside in urban areas. And certainly morbidity rates are higher and life expectancy is lower. In some cases, indigenous people have up to 13 years. The gap is up to 13 years between them and non-indigenous people. And also, they have overall very poor educational attainment, and therefore the upper mobility in societies is limited. So, there are approximately 45 million indigenous people in the region, and it seems as if this figure is underestimated. On average, if we consider the total population of Latin America at over 600 million, is 7.2%, but that masks its very important relevance in countries like Bolivia, Guatemala, Peru, Mexico, including Chile. And those numbers, I understand, are official, but they may be underestimating their numbers because people don't want to self-identify as indigenous due to the stereotypes that have happened in the past. At the moment of the encounter, there were more than 55 million in the Western Hemisphere. And in the next 80 years, there was a demographic collapse due to exposure to virus for which they didn't have immunity. And the other thing that it's important is that Latin America is a region that it's not mixed because of its indigenous background, but there is a very large presence of Afro descendants and Asian descendants. Due to the demographic collapse of the population, manpower was needed in extractive activities, and therefore first the Portuguese and then the British, they brought more than 12 million African residents to the Western Hemisphere, and many millions of them ended up in what is known today to be Latin America. So it is a very mixed continent or region. The dependency ratios and aging varies, and we see high dependency ratios, and that includes both children and older persons. However, there are cases like Uruguay, for example. And in these dependency ratios, children represent a higher proportion, except for Uruguay, for example. And I have 2 minutes, so I'm going to go almost directly into my recommendations, because these are just descriptions of poverty. In the paper, there's going to be, there are tables. There's also information about indigenous girls and women, and about the high morbidity rates, malnutrition, and lower expectancy. So regarding recommendations, it is of major importance that that nations initiate, or even better, that they improve educational campaigns to insist in the legacy, in the very positive legacy of being nations that are multi-ethnic, multilingual, multicultural, and they have to do this in conjunction with indigenous communities representatives, not on their own, because they won't be able to do it on their own anyway. It's very important that we acknowledge the crucial role of indigenous women, and that we adopt also a gender perspective in the work of raising the awareness, which was also very clearly stated by Shanti in her presentation about Asia. In the legislation, there is supposed to be previous consult with communities about the use of their land, but that's not the case. And that's been the origin or the reason why there's been wide and extensive protests and social movements leading to activists who have been persecuted and even killed. And in the paper, there are examples of those cases. There is a wide public service gap, and this would be for electricity, drinkable water, and sewage systems between indigenous and non-indigenous people, and those gaps are quite substantial in a sample of more than 15 countries for which information exists. In terms of healthcare, a lot of research is needed to better understand the use of traditional healing processes and how indigenous communities understand a healthy life, and also how they treat it. A very large proportion of indigenous people do not access the services of the more westernized traditional physicians or providers, health providers, and they combine those with their own traditional healing methods. So we need to see more collaboration to see how we can better combine those ways of thinking about health and life. Although there's been a lot of progress in primary education in all Latin American countries, thus children are enrolled, it is also true that a very small proportion of indigenous teenagers complete their high school diploma, and therefore they cannot continue their education. They cannot get into into universities or technical schools. Technical and financial assistance in support of indigenous entrepreneurship should be provided, and all of the studies, research that I've consulted reveals that we need more data, more research, and that is crucially important in order to monitor for progress. Thank you.
And also give another round of applause to all our presenters today. I forgot to introduce myself, and I got too excited, and I lost myself. I'm Ruth Yanxia, professor in Child, Youth, and Family Studies at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and I'm really honored to be the moderator today. Since we don't have much time left, and first I'm also part of this expert meeting group and for family policy for social inclusiveness. And we would like to open the questions to our expert group members first. From the group? Yes, press your button, please. Thank you.
I really appreciate all the presentations and especially the perspectives from so many parts of the world. Wonderful. I was curious, I wondered if each of you could comment on, I appreciated what Bahara was saying about the fact that we have a growing youth population. You all touched on the fact that we have a growing aging population also, but I only heard in the comments the challenges and what we needed to do to make sure that youth were engaged? And do you see that that role is also important and significant for an aging population, and that they also are an asset in our future?
Thank you for this very important question. Yes, of course, would be the answer. There are efforts underway. Again, tomorrow we're going to be discussing some of this, but for example, in Germany, they've instituted, these are called Mehrgenerationshäuser. That's one word, yeah, but it means multiple generations living under one roof. But the idea behind that is that you bring young people and elderly people together, and they share knowledge with each other and services, and they cooperate to build a different, they're not necessarily related to each other, but they're building new family types with one another. And so each has a productive role in these Mehrgenerationshäuser. So that's just one example of how we can bring the different generations together and create stronger intergenerational solidarity, which I think is key towards building inclusive societies.
Yeah, all over Africa, there are attempts to build intergenerational programs, and intergenerational relations are being challenged, mainly because perhaps because of disjuncture between generations. Young people who are very educated may be born out of parents who have never been to school, so communication might be a problem. But there are many programs that are being tried to make sure that there's good relationship between the two.
You have a question? Okay. Do you like to? I think I prefer to take it.
Okay, I just wanted to mention, as Bahira was relating, as we all are families to SDGs, that we have been, as some of you know, working for 3 years on this project about SDGs and families. We're going to present tomorrow at the same time in the same place. So just to say that you're all cordially invited to it. But talking about this, Bahira, why do you think that family was somehow omitted in the SDGs formulation? That would be my question.
I've actually given this topic a great deal of thought, because it's not just being ignored in the SDGs, it is being ignored on national agendas, it's being ignored in scholarship as well. I think there are multiple factors at work here, but I think part of it is that there's a Western discourse that the individual matters, that individuals don't need families anymore, except in the most basic way when you're a young child, and that after that we are free actors making our own decisions with no ties to anybody. That is the sort of perception that's part of our ethos these days, which is not true at all. It's not true in the United States. It's not true, but that's sort of some of it is fueled out of psychology. Some of it. I'm not going to blame it all on psychology, but it is the focus on the individual. Also, families, I think, are associated, and I hate to say it this way, but there's no other way to say it. Families are associated with women and with gender issues, and that is just something that in our society we consider secondary. Politics, economics, all of that dominates. I was on a panel at Yale University with some of my alumni. I went to Yale as an undergraduate, and I was with several men. I was the only woman on the panel, and they were talking about gun control. They were talking about economic policy, blah, blah, blah. I talked about work-family reconciliation and policies. Most of the discussion was about gun control. That was like the whole room, more people than in this room. After we were all done, this panel of 6 people, and by the way, I was sitting here, and all the men were sitting like this, yeah? No, it was visually very, very interesting, and they all had a microphone, and I had to share the microphone. After we were done, all the women who were in the room came up to me and they said, you were talking about my life. Every day I live this. I'm 55 years old. I am dealing with my teenage children, my elderly parents. I have a job on top of this, and my husband wants this and that, and I am on medication. No, people said this to me. I've never laid eyes on them before. So in our society, this is considered a secondary issue. And it is a huge problem because we are all dealing with it. And how can we talk about inclusive societies and building all this peace and all of this if we don't address people's personal lives and how they are managing their personal lives and their work lives? And a lot of this comes out of globalization, I think. So like I was saying before, that the market is dominating. Sorry, I've given this topic so much thought. So.
Again, thank you all for your presentations today. I know it's a little uncomfortable to ask this question since it is, we're here talking about families and it's a day of the family, etc. But and it's something I struggle with as somebody who does work on family separation and reunification with migrants is, what do we do about the fact that sometimes families aren't all that nice, right? And sometimes people do not want to be, for instance, reunited with their families. And sometimes people do not want to, and all of our programs, of course, are based on and predicated on family. And again, as I mentioned this morning, we're often in this, dealing with programs and policies that are based on this very nuclear family, heteronormative family. So is there any possibility of us having a more flexible and, as you have all pointed out, a much more realistic kind of reflection of what families are and what they do for people? Is there a way that we can embrace that broader definition to address some of the things that are that don't compel and reinforce families that maybe aren't so necessarily so healthy for people? How do we deal with that?
I try to give you a perspective on that, and I welcome your comment because we don't want to idealize, this major structure in society. So I think that it like always, it depends on context. So, for example, in individuals, they need, as they grow, certain type of support, and we need institutions. So we grow and become, as as you were saying before, individuals, good citizens of the world. And maybe you can do it in a place like Canada. And maybe you can do it in a place like Spain, and maybe you can do it in a place like Germany, right? But when there is a lot of violence around you, when you lack proper institutions, when you don't have access to basic services, it might not be consanguinean family relationship. It could be a community, the extended concept of the community, the extended family that will provide this type of safety net that the abstract society can't provide because it's failing you as an individual. It's failing. Maybe you have it if you are upper middle income and high income, right? And if you end up in joining a university or a setup like that has such an incredible structure of support for your development. I work in one of those institutions that costs $70K a year. And in an institution like that, you cannot fail. So that becomes like your family. And so you can come from a very dysfunctional family, and yet you're gonna succeed because you have that sort of support. But I think that there are more than 1 billion of us in different places where you better get along in some form of a extended co-residence community that will provide that support, I think.
Thank you. Many thanks for your presentation. They were all great. My name is Mohammed Lutfi. I'm the representative of Disabled People International at the United Nations. I have to admit that this is a topic that is new to me, addressing issues of family, although like I work on social inclusion for persons with disabilities. And because of that, I would like to ask you, when we talk about inequalities in society, I believe that one of the major reasons of enhancing inequalities in society is attitudes and culture. So I believe that to transform our societies into a rather inclusive places, we have to start from families. However, families that are facing socioeconomic challenges, father doesn't have a job, mother doesn't have, children don't have opportunities to go to schools, they cannot be subject for like social awareness probably, but maybe you disagree with me. But I would like to know your perspective about how we can, in a world that's very chaotic nowadays and very power-oriented, how can we start from families to change social perspectives because of the significance of family as a unit in society? Thank you.
I think it's an institution that you can work with. It's an institution that can be targeted. It is very concrete, it's real, compared to, say, for example, class. The family is an institution that, there is tremendous potential for that institution. Of course, there are problems also within those institutions, but we need to work towards addressing, say, for example, violence within the family. There are many ways in which we can target to address that violence within the family. So I think it's worth trying to safeguard that institution rather than do away with it, because it is one institution that is there. It takes care of the elderly, it takes care of the children, it takes care of the disabled with minimal cost. If you want to institutionalize it outside the family, these forms of care outside the family, it becomes very depersonalized. The emotional and emotive and intimate dimension of care gets very diluted compared to when it is taking place within the institution of the family. So I know there are issues, there are problems, but we need to work on it and try and see how we can. We have seen that this institution has been critiqued and challenged for its inability to guarantee, safe space. It's not able to, but predominantly, I would say. I wouldn't say, if they say 1 in 5 families are subjected to domestic violence, for example, we have 4 which is not. So that one we have to target and help so that there is, an institution with minimal cost which we can engage with to address societal issues, problems, concerns, and also inculcate values of peace. And, like in Bahira's presentation, that is one location in which we can inculcate certain values that are important for peaceful, inclusive society.
I just want to make one quick comment, which is, as an anthropologist, we've survived over these millions of years because we're tribal, because we attach to a small group of people. Whatever that, however, it's not about the exact family structure that we're talking about, but all of us need some kind of social relationships, some small group that we attach to. That's how we've survived, yeah? When people go off on their own with no social relationships, that is when the problems start and we get these terrible crimes in society and all of that sort of thing. So we're not advocating for a specific family type, big families of choice, whoever you consider your emotional group, but that is what we need to survive.
We have or?
There is another event actually at 3 o'clock. So whoever wants to attend that event needs some time to cross the street. It's in the church center. And then Ryan, and I would like to acknowledge also the presence of Ryan and Ben. They are from the New York NGO Committee on the Family. So they are organizing next event, which is on fostering family-friendly cities. And I think there was some interest about this topic as well on SDG 11. And just to mention that we have a background paper, very detailed paper on family policies and SDGs 16 and 11, written by Bahira, available on our website. We also have other papers on the issues of many social inclusion issues, including migration, available on the website. And just to remind everybody that tomorrow there will be another event here at 1:15 as well, and it will be launch of a SDGs and Families project, which covers several SDGs, 1 to 5, 8, 11, and part of 16, right? So Dominique will be presenting on this, and we invite you all to come. So maybe if you have any other questions, if you come tomorrow, we'll try to answer them. Okay.